Hello, I'm Dr. Walter Dorn, and I'm delighted to be teaching this course, DS 567, on global power and institutions. And I particularly look forward to interacting with you after the LDs, including this lecture discussion on the realist approach, the evolution of global politics. Now, you'll already have been introduced to the basic schools of international relations theory, that is, realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Now I'm going to do a deeper dive into realist thinking, how they view the evolution of world politics through a realist lens. Allow me to share my screen so that you can see the outline for this particular lecture. We're going to look at the great cases and the concepts of realist thinking. We'll be taking in the historical approach with a brief look at primitive human beings and the state of nature. Then moving on to ancient Greece and the Peloponnesian War. Then looking at the rise and fall of empires through a video. And then particularly the Holy Roman Empire of the 1600s and the 30 Years' War, which ended in the Treaty of Westphalia that, according to realists, gave rise to the modern nation state. Then we'll jump to the Congress of Vienna of 1815 after the Napoleonic Wars and look at the realist mechanisms that were set up at that point. We'll look at World Wars I and II as they applied to realism and the Cold War, and then realism today, while finally looking at the limitations of realism. So let's start with the state of nature, the animal kingdom. Well, the majority of animals are herbivores that don't attack each other, but almost all areas of the world have predators. And there is, in all animals, this fight or flight instinct. Violence is so ubiquitous in the animal kingdom, both between species, we're fighting over territory and food, and both within species, where they also fight over mates. And violence is also seen in non-human primates. And of course, humans are part of the animal kingdom. So for classical realists, human nature is pretty much coming out of the state of nature, and that we have to deal with the basic problem of human instinct. In the early periods, humans would gather in groups and hunt together and fend off the capture from wild animals. And they would have to organize themselves to some extent in roles of different types. Those are the cutters in this case, or the spear throwers, those who start the fires, those who keep the animals away. And as human beings evolved, we see that the hunter-gatherers became agrarian, and that you had a revolution around 12 millennia ago, where settlements and towns gave rise to small cities. But if you look at the archaeological evidence, you'll find that massacres are very common between different groups, between different families, and between different towns. And over the centuries, the archaeologists have looked at how these skulls and other human remains have been affected by violence. We find that over time, there is less violence inflicted upon it by human beings. There's less death through violent means. But at the same time, it's still very prominent in human history. And we can go into the rise of Egypt and the enslavement of the Israelis, or the kingdoms and the empires where there was such brutality. We can also look at the early city-states, such as Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Here's a map that shows Athens relatively in the center, and the control that it had in the yellow areas where it had allies. Now, Athens was a growing naval power, and Sparta was a militarized society that had substantial strength on land. And the history of this war was written up in a classical work called The History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. He was an Athenian general and historian, and he sought objectivity. He's often considered a realist because of the way he wrote about the actions, but he's also a realist critic in the sense that we will see. He looked at the causes of this great war, the calamity of the Peloponnesian War, and he asked to the question why they broke the treaty, that is the treaty that Sparta and Athens had had previously, after a previous war. I answer by placing first an account of their grievances and the points of differences between the Spartans and the Athenians, so that no one may ever have to ask the immediate cause which plunged the Greeks into a war of such magnitude. The truest cause, I think, is the one which was officially hidden: the growth of the power of Athens and the fear which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. So this concept of a growing power causing fear in its neighbors or in others is sometimes called the Thucydides trap, and it has been applied in recent times to the growth of China, challenging the US power in the world today. A little bit more, look at that a little bit more later. It's all part of a broader security dilemma. That is, when one nation's power is growing, then it seems to threaten the power of others. In this case, it was Athens' decision to build the long walls that would link it to seaport. It was a defensive measure, but was considered a potential for offense because it would strengthen Athenians' naval power. And so this is a classical security dilemma. As one side tries to strengthen its power, it causes fear in the other side, which causes an escalation of conflict. And as the Athenians were waging war, they had to find more allies. So they went to the islands in the Aegean Sea, and they spoke to the people of Milos. And one of the Athenian generals said to the Melians in very brutal, realpolitik, realist language, "What is just is arrived at in human arguments only when the necessity on both sides is equal." Then he went on to say, "The powerful exact what they can, while the weak yield what they must." So these are statements of classical realism. The first being a balance of power. Once the sides are relatively equal, then they can talk about what is just. But when there's hegemonic power, when one side is so much stronger than the other, then they can exact their will on the other side, and the weak must yield. But the story of the Peloponnesian War is not one of the victory through brutality. In fact, the Athenians had much hubris after their earlier victory over the Persians, and then now with their sea power. They even staged an attack on faraway Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, and were defeated there. So actually Athens loses the war, but both Athens and Sparta are weakened by the battles of the Peloponnesian War, and Macedonia actually becomes the great empire, the next great empire, because it benefited from the weakness of both the Spartans and the Athenians. So the lessons of the Peloponnesian War are realpolitik and the power of politics, but there are greater lessons which we can see about the damage or the problems that are caused by a realist point of view. Now let's look at other empires and other actions through this video, which shows from around 2000 BC to the present time, over 4 millennia. And we can see the rise and fall of empires as they exert their force in this area centered on the Mediterranean.
Forest love.
Okay, so we have the rise and fall of the empires through brute force. And we next move to an empire called the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted a millennium and which was challenged over the millennium, of course, many times. But there's an important realist consequence from this, and that is the rise of the modern nation state. And here we have to look at the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century, which you can see has this vast expanse from the North Sea down to the Mediterranean Sea. Martin Luther challenged the Catholic Church with his 95 Theses in 1517. This is considerably earlier than 1600, but it was the origin of the 30 Years' War, which I will explain. Luther also translated the Bible into German and therefore gave access to the locals, to the people, something that previously could only be provided by the Catholic Church. And so he broke the stronghold of the Catholic Church on the profession of religion. And similarly, King Henry VIII declared the Anglican Church in 1534. Now, the 30 Years' War was a result of this division between states, that is principalities and princely states, which wanted to adopt Lutheranism and then Calvinism, versus those which wanted to stay with Catholicism. And if we look at the way that these religious wars were fought, they were extremely brutal. Here we have the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, where you have the Holy Roman Empire broken up into little bits of fighting. And on one side was the red, pro-Catholic, with Spain and the Habsburg monarchy, and then the Lutherans in white. And then there was an alliance with France, which happened to also be Catholic, but in this case allied with Sweden, Protestant. And France and Sweden were largely victorious, but not after there had been substantial decimation in the German lives. The towns were destroyed, agricultural collapsed. There were 8 million dead. That's 1/3 of the population, going from 21 million to 13 million by the end of the war in 1648. And this trade was crippled throughout Europe, and it caused massive inflation. So the effects were felt all over the continent. So when the nobles and the kings came to the agreement in Westphalia, they decided on some principles that would help prevent this kind of war from happening again. The German princes got freer control from the Holy Roman Emperor, and they could also determine the state's religion, although they must permit the freedom of private Christian worship. And this is considered the beginning of the notion of sovereignty, where a nation state could make determinations on its own without the pressure of the church or of an empire. There was a limited version of secularism, whereby the princes had to guarantee that Calvinists and Lutherans could practice, or Catholics could practice within their state. And we see the rise of this Westphalian state, which is often used in realpolitik thinking. So at the end of the 16th century, the Holy Roman Empire was much reduced. You can see it surrounded in the red line here. And we saw other movements that gave rise to different ways of thinking. The American Revolution of 1776, this put a lot of emphasis on the sovereignty of the people, that is democracy. And they overthrew King George III of Great Britain. Then in 1789, the French had a revolution where they overthrew their king, Louis XVI. And that gave rise to Napoleon, the rise of Napoleon, who fought for a republic, but in fact tried to reassert king-like powers, emperor-like powers during the period which he had victories. And that ended in 1815 when Napoleon had managed to conquer vast areas in Europe. But he was ultimately defeated. And so the European powers had to decide how to prevent this kind of wars of religion and ideology from happening again. And they decided to create a concert of Europe, that is a group of states that would work in concert to be able to create a balance of power so no one state could become so powerful that would threaten the others, to avoid the kind of phenomenon that had happened under Napoleon. And this balance of power seemed to be working very well. In fact, for a century, it seemed to be holding Europe from having the kind of wars that had plagued Europe for so many centuries previously. But there were exceptions, of course, with the French Franco-Prussian War of 1871 and the brief interlude in Crimea in the 1850s. But all of this balance of power broke down in the shot that rang around the world. When the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian in the terrorist group Black Hand, Gavrilo Princip, on the 28th of June, 1914. And Ferdinand was the heir apparent of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this set in motion a series of events that caused a series of secret treaties to be invoked. And pretty soon, nations found themselves at war. It's the famous correspondence between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas, which I call the Willy-Nicky correspondence, whereby they said, we don't want our forces to go to war. We're cousins, but we want to make sure that that our honor is upheld, and then the generals have their way without causing war. But they were unable to prevent the hubris from spilling over, and pretty soon it was a world war, with the main causes being militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And you can look at these tendencies and look at them as the realpolitik of what actually does happen when power is accumulated, but you can also view it as a critique of realist tendencies, the arms races, national movements, which are blown onto a fire that was sparked by the shot in Sarajevo, and then all of the other rivalries contributing to this growing fire. Now, at the end of World War I, the Europeans could hardly claim to be the civilizing force of the world because there had been such widespread destruction, about 15 million lives. And the settlement of World War I came through the Treaty of Versailles. It did end the empires of the Ottomans and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany was much reduced in size. But the victors kept their colonies under supervision. And at the Paris Peace Conference, there was a struggle between the realism as expressed by France, which wanted harsh reparations on Germany, and territorial and military restrictions, versus the liberalism of the United States, which wanted self-determination, the use of referenda and plebiscites, wanted the rule of law in international affairs, and the creation of an international organization devoted to the peace of the world, that is, the League of Nations. And neither side actually was able to secure the peace or get fully what it wanted. And this gave rise in the 1930s to the centralization of power in fascist Germany and communist Soviet Union under Hitler and Stalin. These were realpolitik in the extreme, power-based regimes, totalitarian regimes who were willing to engage in total war and commit aggression on their neighbors and on their own citizens. Here are the German troops in occupied Poland in 1939. Now that war also involved Japan and the United States after Pearl Harbor, and involved an evolution in technology, so that we have at the end of World War II the use of the atomic bomb dropped by one plane, causing this widespread destruction. Over time, 200,000 lives from Fat Boy that was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. So you see the ultimate weapon being used, and it did bring about the surrender of Japan, or it contributed to it. But at the same time, it brought about an arms race as other nations sought to gain this weapon. And we have the Cold War of about 40 years, where nuclear and conventional weapons races were common, reaching about 80,000 nuclear warheads in the world at the peak. Now we've managed to cut that back to about a tenth. This was also an ideological conflict between capitalism versus communism, but many see that as being just the front. Behind it was the realpolitik of national power. The Soviet Union wanted the destruction of capitalism, and we saw the rise of the left in Europe and Asia, and this was seen as a threat to the powers that be. And in order to strengthen each side, they formed alliances. NATO was formed in 1947, and the Warsaw Pact 6 years later. And there was also an engagement in espionage. The KGB was doing a lot of subterfuge, and the CIA had to match that and engage in actions that would constrain the Soviet Union. And this involved proxy wars, even in the period of decolonization in Africa. Now, the end of this Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union came as a surprise to pretty much everyone, including both the realists and the liberals. And the breakup of the Soviet Union can be viewed as the breakup of another European empire, as it broke up from one state into 15 states. Now, if we look at realism today, you can say that the use of force and power is still a predominant tendency in human affairs. Russia annexed Crimea. China is crushing dissent in Hong Kong and Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs. The Myanmar military has staged a coup where it gained total control, and the Syrian government is crushing the rebellion. Liberal institutions seem helpless, and this seems like these are cases of power over principle. The realist lessons of history are that there are no permanent allies or enemies, just permanent interests. The states are the main and most important player on the international stage. They're defined by their territory and their populations. The goal is the survival of the state and to counter the threat from other states. And prosperity is a secondary goal, but also an important one, because prosperity is necessary to fund the military and the other elements of power. And the elements of power can be defined through something like DIME, the diplomatic, information, military, and economic means. The realists view the international system as anarchical, that is, being without a ruler, without a central authority. And they view international law and institutions as not being really constraining. And those institutions and laws can only be enforced through state power. So the emphasis is on the power of the state. And what do they prescribe? Well, offensive realists say that the state will maximize its power by achieving hegemony, that is, creating the fear in others and creating power over others so the state can be free to do what it wants. However, there is the problem of the security dilemma, as we saw earlier, and the Thucydides trap, that by doing so, you're only creating more insecurity. Now, defensive realists will not seek hegemony, but seek a balance of power. They realize that it's not good to have one side too powerful, but that we'd rather have a roughly equal distribution of power so that one side does not dominate the other side and then give rise to war. But all of this has its limits. The limits of realism have been spelled out by my colleague Milou Chinufi, who did his PhD in this area, that the realists make an assertion of theoretical determinism, that their view of the world through power is really independent of the states that are doing it. This is universal. And they also say that the wars among great powers are likely, but they deny the interdependence of these states. They deny the effects of trade, cooperation on common threats like climate change, and the many ways that modern states now work with each other. They also assert the homogeneity of state behavior, that the political regime or the government is not relevant. All states behave in the same way. And they, in this fashion, they deny the role of the leader, of political parties, of sub-state actors. And it really is a contrast to the constructivist approach to international relations, which we'll get into later in Barbara's lecture. They have cynicism towards international organizations. They see them as just being a tool in the hands of great powers. And they are denying that there is forms of global governance and problems without passports, which we will deal with and which are very prominent in the world today. And their view is rather static. The world and human nature remains the same for most early human beings. They deny the evolution of human society, and they have trouble coming to terms with the European Union and the fact that Europe is now at peace after millennia of conflict. The counter evidence to realism is that there is human progress, that interstate wars are now reduced to near zero. We've hardly had cases where great powers have attacked each other in the past half century or more. We've seen the end of the right of conquest, of empires in the last century, of colonies. We saw the end of slavery in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, the right to duel or capital punishment happening as recently as 34 years ago, and many states have abolished capital punishment. And in general, we see the decrease in violence as shown in Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. We've seen the rise of human rights, equality. Now, of course, it's still an unequal world, but greater equality than ever before. And the rise of international assistance, whereby over $100 billion is given to the developing world through aid. We see the rise of non-governmental and corporate power. And most importantly, we see that values and principles do play a role in international affairs, not just power. And in the next lecture, I'll be talking about the global governance of security, the evolution of ideas and institutions. And we'll see how the concepts of realpolitik and liberal thinking have clashes, but at the same time, they're both necessary to explain the world as we know it. And we hope that the international environment can be guided by one of more principle and ideals, and that this world can eventually become a more peaceful place. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll end, and I look forward to interacting with you and to sharing the liberal concepts in the next lecture. All the best for now. Bye.